be in Ecclesiastes chapter number 3. Ecclesiastes chapter number 3. Ecclesiastes chapter number 3. As we work through this book of Ecclesiastes, I find it an intriguing book, not just because of all of its the numerous different topics. We referenced that before. Essentially, this book is, of course, Solomon exploring the meaning of life, and of course, most importantly, is there a reward for doing that which is right. And of course, we do recall that the vast majority of this book is not written from not just a Christian point of view, obviously, but not even a religious point of view. It's simply a practical, very pragmatic. If I'm a good person, will I get good things? And of course, then if I only live for the fun, do I actually find the meaning I seek? And of course, both those questions are explored very extensively. We look through in the first chapter, we notice, of course, there's a beautiful poem it begins with. And then Solomon begins to introduce the book himself and what he's looking for. In chapter number 2, what we looked at last week. In chapter number 2, of course, we went through, and this is Solomon's first desire, his first goals. Very interesting, but basically he moves on. He talks about a very personal task, almost autobiographical, and basically includes an impossible task to determine the true meaning to life on his own. We come to chapter number 3, and chapter number 3 is very different. There are certain books in the Old Testament and New Testament that have very clear structures. I think specifically of some of the Psalms, or maybe if you remember the book of Lamentations. I love the book of Lamentations. It's weird, I know. That's a strange one to love. It is a beautiful book, but it is very clearly laid out. It has a very clear pattern it follows. Even to the point of the number of the verses in each chapter, it's really intriguing. But Ecclesiastes has a habit of jumping back and forth. I won't say it's like listening to a telephone conversation. It's very, I won't say disjointed, but they jump from one topic to another. It's not a play, but have you ever seen a reader's theater? That's where they all stand up on the stage together. Instead of acting it out, you just have numerous different individuals speaking at different times. And that's kind of the feeling we have. There are a few other books of the Bible that carry this idea. I think Song of Solomon is very similar. We have different characters there that are speaking. We have a few others that are very similar to that. In this case, Solomon is basically using these different ideas that occasionally introduce a whole other thought pattern. And that's what chapter number 3 is. Chapter number 3 is more or less his philosophy that follows up chapter number 2. And in it, he gives a lot better advice than usual. Still not right, but better. Remember, when we read certain passages of the Bible, just because the Bible includes it doesn't mean the Bible is endorsing it. That's one thing I'm afraid a lot of people mess up on. We all know this. In fact, have you ever had someone who really loves history and they'll tell you what so-and-so said back when? And just because they told you that so-and-so said that doesn't mean that they actually think that was a good thing for so-and-so to say, obviously. They're just telling you that's what they said. Job is a classic example of this. Numerous arguments back and forth, arguments that, by the way, are almost exactly the same as the book of Ecclesiastes. But not all of them are things that God endorses until the very end when God pulls it all together and says, all right, these are what everyone thinks, but let me tell you the truth. So we come to chapter number 3, and chapter number 3 is divided into two basic parts. It's a poem, and then it's also, past the poem, it goes on and begins to get a little bit of commentary on the poem and how to apply it. And this chapter, it discusses the idea of perfection within imperfection. Now, do you know any perfectionists in your family? Maybe you are one. I'm not. I know that. There's certain things I'm very perfectionistic on, but most things not so much. My dad is a perfectionist in certain areas, and my little brother is the farthest thing from it. And my older brother's a little bit of one. And so what we'll do when we work together, everyone has a little different way of doing things. I want it to be good enough. It needs to be a solid performance. My dad wants it to be perfect, everything perfect. Like even painting behind things that nobody will ever see. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. My little brother, a good job is a done job. And that's his one priority. It has to be done. My grandfather was probably the biggest perfectionist in my family on my one side. And his famous statement was, perfection is acceptable. Now, we know that's not realistic though. Nothing's really perfect in this life. In fact, many of us don't like the idea of perfection. You ever noticed, in fact, there are certain artists that will really play around with this idea. You ever seen someone that painted a beautiful picture, but something is just a little bit off and you can't put your finger on it? It's not perfect, and that's why it's intriguing. And in fact, it's so perfect without being perfect that you have to stare at it and it gives you this feeling of unease, like something's not right. Or maybe it is perfect, and as a result, you don't like it. Do you like the picture of the Mona Lisa? I never saw the appeal of the Mona Lisa. To each their own. It's not my cup of tea. But I think one of the reasons why some of us feel less comfortable looking at it is because the picture is, oddly enough, more symmetrical than most of us. In fact, you'll find that most of us, we like symmetry when it comes to our faces, but we don't like perfect symmetry. We like it close, but not quite perfect. Because perfect doesn't seem real. It doesn't seem lifelike. It seems a little bit off. Here we find Solomon in chapter number 3 does not talk about his personal experiences. Instead, he talks about this idea of finding perfection in life and yet not finding it quite right. Something's off with the human experience, and he leads us to the interesting conclusion that we will never understand it. There are certain things that always bug us a little bit that we cannot comprehend because we're human. And the human experience is imperfect. Now, I love this because in this chapter, he is going to come the closest so far to his final argument at the end of the book. And he gives us some very intriguing doctrinal truths that I think we need to take with us, that, by the way, answer many of the questions of Job, many of the questions of the Psalms, many of the questions even in the New Testament when we find Pharisees who look at the disciples and look at those who struggle in their lives, and they ask, well, if God blesses you, why are you struggling? And here we find chapter number 3 begins to approach that idea. So we're going to read the first couple of these verses. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the most famous passages of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of those strange books that people don't understand 90% of it, but the 10% they're familiar with, everyone remembers. And that's the beginning of this chapter. Chapter number 3, it says, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing." Let's pray. Father, as we come before you, we ask you to please help us to understand this passage this evening. Help us to do it justice as you would have us. Help us to glorify you as we seek to better understand your purpose in our life. And Lord, help us especially to be to honor that purpose and be to follow you and obey you as you see fit. We ask this in your Son's precious name. Amen. First thing we're going to look at this evening is we're going to look at the perfect poem, almost perfect poem. Now, as we start off, you'll find that this poem is an interesting one. There's a poetical poem here. So we're going to look at the theological perfection in a moment, but right now we're going to start with the poetical perfection. Now, do you like poetry? I'm not a huge fan, but I like Bible poetry. Other poetry is great. It's just something I've never really excelled at. But Bible poetry, of course, is structured very differently from our English poetry. There are some similarities for sure, but verses 1 through 8 contain this poem, specifically verses 2 through 8, but 1 is kind of the introduction. And in this poem, it is set up, and it's very important. Now, I regret that I do not know. I wish I was fluent in Hebrew so I could be able to read it in the Hebrew, because then you can see some of the other pieces. But for most of us, that's not possible. So we see it from the English, and we use good dictionaries. And in this passage, it's an intriguing one because this poem is really very artistic, almost perfect. But by design, it appears that there's a slight couple of poetical imperfections that are meant to draw our focus. And it seems as if Solomon is giving us this great, perfect idea with a little bit of something off. And I think that's his focus here. So as he starts off, this poem is built on the idea of 7. Now, 7 is a number that repeats numerous times in the Bible. It's not something I often focus on, but this passage is absolutely set up on 7s. Now, in my life, I like tens. I like the base 10 system because it makes sense. And deep down, do you know, I almost regret the fact that we do not use the metric system. Out of custom and tradition, I love the old standard, but I have to admit, the metric makes more sense. But it's just one of those things we use standard because we've always used standard. Well, in the Bible, most of the idea was that 7 has that same very important element to much of the Old Testament Jewish culture. Most of the time, we point out to the fact that it reminds us of the 7 days of creation, that God made the world in 7 days, technically 6, and he rested on the 7th. So everything that they would set up on 7s was supposed to remind them of their great Creator. So it makes a little bit more sense when we talk about numbers being important. It's not so much the number is important, but rather the Creator is. That's a way to remind themselves. So this poem very strongly uses the number 7. So what you'll find is there are 7 couplets. Now, we've used that word before. A couplet is basically in this passage where you have 2 very closely connected ideas that kind of balance each other out. At least in this passage, I won't say opposites, but they're close. First one is found in verse number 2, a time to be born and a time to die. I don't think we have to go into detail to show how that those are related. It's obviously kind of supposed to balance each other out. So as we look through this, you'll find in this case, there are 7 of these throughout this entire passage. There are 14 sayings as well, another multiple of 7. And then as you go through, it's the same thing all the way through. Now, in fact, I believe there are a couple pieces that aren't quite right. They're close, but not quite right. In fact, if you drop down to verse number 5, the very center of it, verse number 5 is probably the most strange verse of the entire passage, and we'll get there in just a second, and scholars do argue about exactly what this verse means. But verse number 5 shows us one of the biggest imperfections of the poem, and it's intentional. Verse number 5 uses a different number of words than all the other couplets. Most all the other couplets, accounting for translation and all those other pieces, use the same parallel structure. A time to be born, 4 words, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. All of those have a very similar rhythm. But verse number 5's rhythm is a little bit different. Like I said before, I believe this is intentional. You'll also find there's a few other strange pieces that are so close, but not quite. Now, why is Solomon playing with a style? Let's get back to his content, because that's where I'm more comfortable. Because I think he's telling us of this very clear and one of the most understandable of all world philosophies, all life philosophies, is live a simple life and find happiness in what you do. Very simple. Classic Epicureanism, you can even lean a little Stoicism in there. But he still says something's a little off. And that's the conclusion he comes to in chapter number 3. And even as if we were native speakers, that feeling would almost come through even in this poem. So let's look at some of his words, and let's see what point he's trying to make. So he goes back and forth, either offering positives and negatives, opposites maybe, or maybe just different dualities of the same idea, back and forth. First one's easy. It says, a time to be born and a time to die. Building on verse number 1, it's the idea that there is a time and a season for everything. All of us have a time when we're born, and we all have a time when we die. That old statement, there's only 2 sure things in life, death and taxes, that's kind of the feeling that we get here. Something we cannot avoid. No matter how healthy you are, how rich you are, rich and poor will one day meet together in the grave. Now, of course, that seems almost morbid, but there's also a little bit of beauty here, of course, from a godly perspective that Solomon at this point is not playing with. He then goes on and says, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Now, what you'll notice is Solomon is going from a very personal aspect and slowly working out, with the exception of verse number 5. He starts out with the most personal thing we all have, birth and death. Next, he goes to what you grow in your garden. We all know there's a time you put your potatoes in and there's a time you pull them out. Otherwise, you kind of miss the whole point, right? If you grow potatoes for the looks, well, good for you. The rest of us want to eat them. So we know there's a time you got to pull them out of the ground. He goes on and says, not only that, he says a time to kill and a time to heal. Now we're getting even more social. We know there is a time that we have to kill. Now, this could be from self-defense or war, as we see in a moment, or it could just be from a simple agrarian lifestyle agrarian perspective, there's a time when you try to get that young chicken to, live through the night. Then there's a time that you kill that chicken for supper. We all know this is the way it works. It's just the way life works. There's a time to put an animal down, and there's a time to heal that animal. There's a time for us to die, and there's a time for us to heal. He goes, and a time to break down and a time to build up. Another easy one. We all have had that experience. There's a time where you build something new in your house, and then you get tired of it 10 years later and tear it out, or it rots or whatever else. Which one's better? Well, that's all for us to all decide on our own. That old classic adage, what are the two best days in any man's life? The day he buys a boat and the day he sells the boat, right? That's kind of the idea we have, back and forth. Now, do you remember what Solomon's already played around with? He's already played around with the idea of these impossible philosophical tasks that he never can understand. Or chapter number 2, the endless nature of all of life together. If I simply live and die, have I really made a difference? And of course, he comes to chapter number 3, and we see him almost accepting this idea, that this is the way it's supposed to be. So he's going back and forth from these extremes. He says in verse number 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh. Life teaches us that this is obvious. There's a time for funerals and there's a time for birthday parties. It's just the way it works. There's a time to enjoy those good times and also understand there's a time to mourn and then to be able to enjoy those good times again. Now we get to verse number 5. This is one of the most intriguing ones because in this particular verse, he actually adds an object here. And of course, the object is the stones. It's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Now, people do argue about exactly what kind of stones we're gathering and why. Why stones? All the other ones are life experiences. But why are we gathering stones here? Is it the idea we're gathering stones out of our gardens and putting them alongside our walls so that we can have greater productivity? Is it the idea that the stones I gather out of my neighbor's yards and out of their fields when they plow, and then I put them back in when my neighbor makes me mad? There's actually a theme that there's a lot of people who believe that. And that does kind of fit here too. He then goes on, of course, building on this idea of this social interaction of casting away stones, the idea of, in my opinion, probably tearing down a fence between neighbors because you've mended some relationships. Then there's also a time here to gather back stones and build that fence because you have to. That brings us to the next section of verse number 5, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. Here we get into those who are collectors or hoarders versus those who are minimalists and will keep nothing. Reality is we know both extremes are not good. You've met hoarders, haven't you? Those who cannot let go of anything and to their own detriment. Or maybe you met those who can't keep anything because they just can't do it. So they're always buying things new and getting rid of them. When if they just saved them for a little bit, they'd be okay. Solomon's playing with the idea that there's a time for both. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. Now I find this one interesting. Always knowing when you should speak up and when you should keep your mouth shut is really hard for a lot of us. Some of us do it at all the wrong times. You tell that joke that would have been great 90% of the time, but not now. Too soon. Not the right environment. Or maybe you try to comfort someone when really you just needed to hold your tongue and be there for them. Or perhaps there's a time when you speak in wrath when you really should have been quiet. Or maybe like Solomon's own conundrum that he shares with us in the book of Proverbs, he'll talk about how to answer a fool. Do you remember that passage? In fact, there are two of them. I've had an argument with someone over this before. It's really intriguing. One time he says, do not answer a fool according to his folly. And the other times he says, answer a fool, else he thinks he's wise in his own conceit. What's the takeaway? There's no good time to answer a fool. No matter what you're doing, if you argue with a fool, it's not going to be good. That's kind of what he's playing with these ideas. It's some of these questions he's asking and he's suggesting is the fact that the truth is somewhere in between. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. You ever wonder when you look at world history why all the allies are actually allies? I always find it intriguing if you look back in the last 300, 400 years in Europe, all the countries that hated each other so severely for so long, only to be allies in the very next war. Really interesting. The Crimean War is a classic example. And I always have to look up who was allied with who, because the very previous war, all the sides were different. All of them. It's like, what in the world? Or the difference between World War I and World War II when it comes to Japan. World War I, they were an ally. World War II, they were an Axis. And now they're our ally again, even after Pearl Harbor and the 2 atomic bombs. We understand that allies and enemies change. A time for war and a time for peace. He then, as he continues on, he continues with his last idea of what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth. Verses 1 through 8 give us this rather beautiful idea of all the poem, yes, is a very perfect and precise poem with some oddities to make the writer remember that just as perfect as life isn't perfect either. There are some things that we think about life, that things that should be right, and they aren't and don't make sense. So then he goes back to his original theme. Building upon these first 8 verses, he then says, okay, so what does that mean for us? Life is a mixture of oddities. Life is one contradiction after another. Things that are necessary. It's good to have good times. It's good to have bad times. It makes life rich and beautiful. But does that help us understand the meaning of life? He then says in verse number 9, what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? Remember, this is a central theme of this entire book. Is there a reward for doing that which is right? Is there a reward for doing good? Now, as I mentioned before, in my opinion, chapter number 3 comes the closest to the truth so far. He's going to go right back to where he had been previously, but he's playing around with this idea one more time. So he moves on from the poetical perfection to now we see our second point, the theological perfection. And here we find true perfection. He says in verse number 10, switching to his own perspective now, leaving aside the old poetical style, verses 1 through 8, he says, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their hearts so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. Verse number 11 is probably the most important verse until the very end of this chapter. This is his theme. He says, God makes all things beautiful. Remember, this is the theme he'll end the book with. So as he starts off in verse number 10, his words is, I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. The word travail here is probably not one you've used recently, but it's literally the job God gave us. Now, some have pointed out, now this might be a bit beyond, we don't want to go into it right now, but some have pointed out that the book of Ecclesiastes borrows very heavily from the style and structure of the early part of the book of Genesis. And in fact, some have even pointed out that some of the names that are used in the book of Genesis, there are some word plays in Ecclesiastes, and all that's intriguing. But it does point to the fact that there is a huge relationship between the two. What is the primary goal that God gave man in the Garden of Eden? First of all, to keep and tend the garden and to walk with his God. Notice, man focused on the first one and forgot the second one. Isn't that funny how we do that? Isn't that funny? That's the whole point of the book of Ecclesiastes. That's the whole point of Job. We focus on one while forgetting the relationship. Well, we also recall that after man fell, here again we find the same thing happen. God says, remember what was man's job after the fall? He's the curse, right? He says, remember, now you're going to work in the garden, but you're going to experience thorns and thistles and by the sweat of your brow. And then he goes on and extends it also to the woman as well and her part of the curse. He says, I have seen the travail of man, which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He says, all right, first of all, remember, it is God's will that sometimes we struggle. That's the first major assumption he makes. Just like in the garden before and after the fall, work was always intended for man. One time for our edification, one time, well, partly for our good and partly for our punishment. He says the same thing occurs now. It's all part of the curse. He goes on and says, he assumes that this is God's will for the good and the bad times. God expects us to endure and to still serve him. He then goes on, and so the second thing he asserts is in verse number 11, he asserts that God is the one who makes it perfect. This is really beautiful when you remember everything he struggled with in chapter number 1 and 2 and the rest of the book after this one. He says, remember, all the times I've complained about the fact that we work so hard and we get nowhere, that there's nothing new under the sun, that everything we build falls apart, that one man lives, he dies, and the next man moves on, and everyone forgets the first man's name. He says, and we never get anywhere. He says, but remember, what is it that brings perfection? It's God himself. Verse number 11, he hath made everything beautiful in his time. He then goes on and says also, he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. Here again, he's hinting a little bit about where he is going to conclude this chapter. The idea of world in his heart, you'll find this happens in both New and Old Testament. Sometimes God will use the world to talk not just about our physical world, but about our own experiences. In the New Testament, many times you'll see, what is it Jesus says? Lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the world. The word world there is literally this world system and time. The same idea occurs here. It says God has set eternity in our minds and in our hearts so that it is hard for us to understand not what we should do, but what God's plan is. That's where we're going to end up. Remember, this is his focus. He says, as mankind, we will never understand God fully, but we will always be assured that he makes all things perfect. Let's think of some other passages that have the same notion in it. I think, of course, of Romans 8:28. It says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God and to them that are called according to his purpose. Forgive me, I think I misquoted that slightly, but the idea is there. He works all things for our good. We go to other passages and reminded that no man can truly know the works of God. It says, his ways are higher than our ways. It says, just leave it to me. He then goes on, the last point he concludes with, and this point, he says, I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, it is the gift of God. Now this is a straw man argument. He's going to come back and tear this argument up in just about 2 chapters. So he's putting it up here, and he says, this is a good thing, but I have a huge caveat. So don't focus too heavily on this one. It's a good thing if you can enjoy it, but we don't all get to enjoy it. So don't forget about that. But he says in verse number 14, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. For that which has been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. So as we conclude I think I'm in the wrong chapter there. Anyways, as we move on, he says in verse number 4, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. Moving on, we're going to drop down a little bit further. Verse number 15 I was reading from just a moment ago. But then he concludes his whole argument, and he gets rather pessimistic. So he goes from the theological perfection and the poetical perfection to his plain old pessimism. He gets down in the mouth in the last part of this chapter. He complains in verse number 16. He says, I saw under the sun the place of judgment and wickedness, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. You ever seen that before? You see the places where the best things should be, where judgment should occur. This is easy to see in our world. We can see all the time where it seems like the powerful excel, not necessarily the righteous. When it seems like the justice of our world, even our legal system occasionally seems to uphold that which they shouldn't and seems to actually punish those who do what's right. But he then concludes and he says, remember, I might have a pessimistic view, but don't forget, as we move on, he says that God has a say in this. That brings us to the fact that, yes, we live in an unjust world, but we live with a just eternity. Remember, this is not a mindset that Solomon uses for most of this book, but he starts to introduce it here because he's giving us a little bit of foreshadowing about what happens at the end of the book. He said, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work. He then goes on, it says, I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. It says we all have to come to the point in time that we recognize that compared to God, we're like an animal. We have no earthly idea what's going on. I've complained before about trying to take my dogs to the vet. You ever try to take your dog or your cat to the vet? It's really hard. You take them there and the dog or the cat doesn't like being there. One of my dogs is too smart and he knows the vet's trying to do something, so you can't trick him, but he's not smart enough to know what the vet's trying to do. So a simple solution is just threaten the vet. Get the vet out of the room and we'll be okay. I love the words of C.S. Lewis, famous for writing numerous pieces, but his most poignant, in my opinion, the most poignant work he ever wrote was a personal journal that he wrote after his wife died. His wife had battled cancer, thought she'd beat it, then her cancer came back very quickly and took her life very quickly. And he decided that as a Christian, he was going to try to write down what Christians go through with grief. And it's miserable. It's one of the most miserable writings I've ever read. And it makes Ecclesiastes and Lamentations look like comedies. It's dark, very dark. But he concludes at the very end, he says, you know what? After all of my back and forth, does God love me? Is God fair? Why does God allow suffering? He says, I have to realize I'm like a cat. He says, if you take a cat to a vet and you take a cat to a sadist, the cat can't tell the difference. All the cat sees is, I feel pain and I don't like it. But he says, remember, we serve a good God. A God who, yes, does allow pain. A God who does things we do not understand, but that still means he is a good God. This is the conclusion that Solomon is beginning to approach. He will reject this conclusion for quite a bit of this book, but he will come back to it. He concludes in verse number 20, all go into one place. All are dust, all are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. All turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth. He's here again reminding us that we do have an eternal soul. We're almost like a beast that dies, but not quite. He says, wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works. For that is his portion, for who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Now notice verse number 22 is not biblical. He is going to reject verse number 22 at the very end of the book. It's almost as if he's throwing up his hands here, maybe not completely, but almost suggesting, you know what, I'm just going to enjoy life as I have it. But he forgets all those wonderful doctrines he just talked about, that God is a perfect God, that God knows more than us. He says, that's what I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting that, yes, God makes all things beautiful in his time. Doesn't mean that God makes all things the way we like them, but all things beautiful. It is a principle we see all throughout Scripture. In fact, in Scripture, there's a famous quote, there's a famous phrase that is used occasionally. It's the idea of, what doest thou? In fact, you'll find God ask Elijah that when Elijah shows up down in the wilderness, as Elijah is really struggling in his soul, and God will say, what doest thou, Elijah? What are you doing here? He says, this is not who you are, Elijah. Elijah, you know I'm a good God. You know I'll give you power. You know your calling. But why are you in the middle of the wilderness upset over the queen of Israel? He says, what doest thou? It's kind of a reprimand. What in the world are you doing here? What do you think you're doing? But what I find interesting, of the numerous places this phrase is used, you'll find that there are a couple cases where we're reminded that that phrase cannot be used of God. In fact, we'll find Daniel uses it most famously. Solomon will in Ecclesiastes 8 as well. We'll get there eventually. But Daniel chapter number 4, verse 35, it says, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. This is compared to God. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? The conclusion in this chapter, the takeaway for us as Christians, as believers, Old or New Testament, is the fact that God has it under control. What's the old song says? He has the whole world in his hand. That doesn't mean we understand his plans. It just means we have to trust the fact that he knows what's best. Some of Solomon's advice in this chapter is very practical. Enjoy the life you've been given because you've only been given so much of it. Enjoy the good times. In fact, that is a theme that Solomon will endorse very strongly throughout this book. But he always comes back to another hint, but don't forget God in the midst of it. Remember who gave you that life. Remember what God has done for us. And yes, there's good times. Yes, there's bad times. But remember, it is God who makes all things beautiful, even when we don't see the beauty ourselves. So as we conclude, I know this chapter is very different. We'll see in chapter number 4 and some of the others, he'll get back into some of his more of his own personal goals. And some of these are beautiful, beautiful ideas, very practical suggestions. But his takeaway here that he's struggling with is he's forgetting and struggling to remember that God is the one that makes life worth living. As a result, it is God is the one who understands our goals and how life is going, even when we don't. So as Christians, we can be assured of his goodness, of his love, and of his ultimate wisdom. I do want to point out that Job actually will use this very phrase in Job 9. When he's arguing with his friends about what God is doing in his life, the same discussions, he'll remind his friends, it says, remember, none of us can really ask God, what are you doing, God? Because God knows better than us. He reminds us, don't worry, he has it under control. Let's close in a word of prayer, then we'll have a very brief business meeting. Father, as we come before you, we thank you for your goodness and your love to us. Lord, I ask you to please do draw us close to you this evening. We thank you for the fact that you are a good God. We thank you for the fact that as we come to your word, that yes, we find passages of scripture like this that remind us of some of our darker thoughts, but Lord, it also reminds us of the fact that you truly have all under control and that you truly have a purpose for us, and we simply have to trust you. We ask this in your Son's precious name. Amen.